1916. Despite the fact that 1915 was quite successful for the army of the Central Powers, the German command failed to solve the main task, which was the destruction of the Russian army. The Russian army retreated and took up a defense that Germany and Austria-Hungary did not have enough strength to break through. In the current situation, it was decided to concentrate their efforts on the Western Front in order to ensure the defeat of France, until the Russian army had time to regain strength and prepare for offensive actions. For these purposes, the German command began to transfer forces to the Western Front, and the Austro-Hungarian command to the Italian front. The German and Austrian command underestimated the Russian army, which was able not only to quickly restore combat effectiveness and begin preparations for offensive actions, but also partially solve the problem of shell hunger by transferring the entire industry to a military footing. Moreover, the Entente Allies planned in 1916 to launch a coordinated offensive on both the Western and Eastern fronts in order to deprive the enemy of the opportunity to transfer reserves. Meanwhile, the German command launched an offensive on the Western Front, planning to defeat France. Since it was difficult for the French army to contain the enemy's onslaught, the French command turned to the Russian command with a request to conduct a limited offensive in order to draw back part of the German troops. The Russian command went to meet its ally. On March 16, General Evert, with the forces of the 1st, 2nd and 10th Russian armies, launched an offensive near Lake Naroch. Since the enemy did not expect that the Russians would go on the offensive, the 2nd Russian army managed to wedge itself into the defense of the German troops at a distance of up to 9 kilometers. To save the situation, the German command had to pull reserves to the breakthrough site. Part of the reserves had to be transferred from the Western Front, so the Germans were forced to temporarily stop trying to capture the French fortress of Verdun. The transfer of additional forces allowed the German command to stop the advance of the Russian army, but nevertheless, the main task of easing the pressure on the French army was completed. In addition, having stopped the attack of the Russian army, the German command focused its attention on the Western Front, deciding that the Russian command simply did not have the strength to resume the offensive in the near future. Meanwhile, the Russian command focused on preparing a simultaneous offensive with the Entente Allies, which was scheduled for the summer. According to the plan, the Russian army was supposed to launch an offensive along the entire length of the front. The main blow was to be delivered by the forces of the Western Front under the command of Evert towards the city of Vilna. The Northern Front under the command of Kuropatkin was supposed to deliver an auxiliary attack in the Dvinsk area and begin moving towards Vilna, and the Southwestern Front under the command of Brusilov was supposed to attack Lutsk and Kowel in order to go behind the enemy group and begin moving towards the Western Front. The Russian command had concerns that the Austro-Hungarian army could go on the offensive before the Russian troops and thereby disrupt all plans, so it was decided to be ready for an attack earlier than the planned offensive dates. Strangely enough, the foresight of the Russian command saved the Italian army from a crushing defeat. The fact is that on May 15, Austria-Hungary launched a large-scale offensive against the Italian army in the Trentino region. Finding themselves in a difficult situation, the Italian command turned to the Russian command with a request to carry out an offensive with the forces of the Southwestern Army and thereby draw back part of the Austro-Hungarian troops from the Italian front. The Russian command decided to come to the aid of their ally and ordered Brusilov to begin preparations for the offensive. It was this event that led to the emergence of tactics that were revolutionary for that time, the first use of which went down in history as the Brusilov breakthrough. The fact is that, according to the prevailing military theory at that time, for a successful offensive it was necessary to achieve a breakthrough of the enemy's defenses in one place and to develop success by introducing reserves into battle. To solve this problem, forces were assembled at the site of the proposed breakthrough and massive artillery preparation was carried out before the attack. This tactic was used by all parties to the conflict, and therefore, after the start of massive artillery preparation, the defending side pulled reinforcements to the place of the intended breakthrough. Brusilov decided to abandon the use of this tactic. Instead, he decided to achieve a breakthrough of the front with 4 armies under his command. In this case, only one breakthrough was supposed to be the main one, and the rest were auxiliary. A breakthrough of the front in several places, according to Brusilov's plan, was supposed to allow the enemy to competently maneuver his reserves. According to Brusilov's plan, the main blow was to be delivered by the 8th Army under the command of Kowel, while the 7th, 9th and 11th Armies were assigned a supporting role. Despite the fact that 4 Russian armies were opposed by 4 Austro-Hungarian and 1 German armies, Brusilov managed to secure a numerical superiority at the forefront of the attack of each of his 4 armies. On June 3, the Russian army began powerful artillery preparations along the entire southwestern front. Already on June 5, the 7th, 8th, 9th and 11th Russian armies went on the offensive. The enemy armies could not cope with the onslaught of the Russian army, due to which the front was broken through in 13 places. Already on June 7, the city of Lutsk fell into the hands of the Russian army, and by June 15, the 4th Austro-Hungarian army was practically destroyed. The 8th Russian army managed to break through the enemy front 65 kilometers deep. The 11th and 7th armies also broke through the front, but were unable to develop an offensive due to enemy counterattacks. As for the 9th Russian army, after breaking through the front, it successfully advanced and on June 15, having established control over the Chernivtsi fortress. Due to the successful offensive of the Russian armies, there was a threat of losing Kowel, which was an important center of communications. To prevent such a scenario, 2 German divisions were hastily transferred from the Western Front, and 2 Austro-Hungarian divisions from the Italian. On June 16, the Austro-German army tried to launch a counterattack on Kaledin's 8th Army, but was defeated and thrown back across the Styr River. The development of the success of the Russian army was hampered by the fact that the commander of the Western Front, Evert, hesitated and did not launch an offensive. The troops of the Western Front launched an attack only on June 15, but faced with fierce enemy resistance they were forced to return to their original positions. Evert began regrouping his forces, which is why Brusilov did not know how to proceed, continue the attack on Kowel and Lemberg or take up defensive positions in anticipation of the offensive of Evert's Western Front. Meanwhile, the troops of the Northern Front also began an offensive, but when faced with enemy defenses they were forced to return to their original positions. In July, the Southwestern Front received reserves from which a special army was formed, which, together with the 3rd and 8th Armies, was supposed to capture the city of Kowel. The offensive of the Southwestern Front resumed only on July 28, by which time the enemy had managed to organize a powerful defense in the Kowel area using the transferred reserves. The Russian army advanced and was able to advance 10 kilometers, but when faced with well-organized enemy defenses on the Stoked River, it was unable to take Kowel. Meanwhile, the 7th and 11th Armies, which were moving towards Lemberg, managed to break through the enemy's defenses and, having occupied the city of Brody, reached the approaches to Lemberg. At the same time, the 7th Army was able to establish control over the city of Gallic. The successes of the Russian army forced Romania, which until that moment had remained neutral, to enter the war on the side of the Entente. The Romanian army launched an offensive in Transylvania, but it soon became obvious that the poorly trained Romanian army would not be able to fight on equal terms with the armies of the Central Powers. To avoid the defeat of the Romanian army, Zayanchkovsky's 50,000-strong corps was sent to its aid, which, however, was unable to correct the situation. Already on November 29, under the pressure of enemy armies, the Romanian army had to leave its capital, Bucharest. It became obvious that a little more and the Romanian army would be defeated, so the Russian command urgently had to send reinforcements to its new ally. By December 1916, thanks to the arrival of Russian divisions, it was possible to stop the advance of the armies of the Central Powers, after which the Romanian front was formed, which, in addition to the Russian divisions, included the remnants of the Romanian armies. Due to the hasty transfer of forces to Romania, the Southwestern Front lost the opportunity to advance and was forced to take up defensive positions while awaiting reinforcements. The Russian army, starting in December 1916, restored battle-worn divisions and stockpiled ammunition, planning to launch an offensive in the spring of 1917 to break through the enemy front in Dobruja and in the Lemberg region. At the same time, the goals of the proposed offensive were limited, since a turning point in the war had already occurred in favor of the Entente, and the main task of the Russian army was to pin down the enemy's forces so that he could not transfer forces to the Western Front to increase pressure on France. It is difficult to say how successful the operations of the Russian army would have been in 1917, since not military, but political factors intervened in the course of hostilities. The fact is that the February Revolution took place in Russia and Emperor Nikolai II was overthrown from the throne. The provisional government, to which power passed, promised to continue the war until a victorious end, but Order No. 1 adopted by the Council of Workers and Peasants' Deputies, which, by creating soldiers' committees, destroyed the principle of unity of command, launched the process of rapid decomposition of the Russian army. In addition to mass desertion, cases of refusal to go on the attack, as well as fraternization with enemy soldiers, have become more frequent. Despite the rapid disintegration of the Russian army in 1917, by agreement with the Allies, it went on the offensive, which began on June 29. Despite the fact that the Russian army was rapidly losing its combat effectiveness, it still managed to win a number of victories, but after the counterattack of the Austro-Hungarian army, it had to take up defensive positions. Constant rallies in which soldiers participated, as well as refusals to carry out orders, simply did not allow the Russian army to conduct military operations. And it is difficult to say how it would all end in the end, but the October Revolution took place in Russia and the All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies adopted a decree on peace, which assumed Russia's withdrawal from the war, after which the Russian army essentially ceased to exist. Thus, 1917, which, according to the plans of the Russian command, was supposed to bring victory in the war, became a complete disaster for the Russian army, as a result of which it ceased to exist under the influence of not military but political factors. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.